A peaceful beachside community is rocked when a beloved schoolteacher falls victim to a vicious crime.
She was beaten over the head with a blunt object. She suffered devastating injuries.
I heard screams, just absolute screams from everywhere. I instructed everyone just to call 911. I wanted someone there so I could go chase this guy.
As authorities race to track down a dangerous criminal, the investigation zeroes in on a business deal gone bad.
She was getting money from a whole bunch of friends. A lot of people were upset because they never got any of their investment back.
The truth reveals a harrowing betrayal and a secret romance that emboldened deadly passions.
As human beings, we always tend to lash out with the people that we love the most.
I think those two, feeding off of each other, came together to make this the perfect storm that caused this crime.
December 4th, 2016. The evening is winding down in Long Beach, New York, a barrier island off Long Island's South Shore.
It's a beach community, very family-oriented, very social. The 2.1-mile boardwalk is our crown jewel. You can find people every day, even in the winter, exercising, enjoying it. It consistently ranks in the top of the safest cities to live in the United States.
On this night, however, the usual calm of the beach community is shattered at 10:30 p.m. when local resident Franklin Kuzma witnesses something out of the ordinary.
I was doing a normal boardwalk workout, and I noticed someone was walking into their foyer, and they were going home, and someone kind of ran up behind them. And all of a sudden, I heard lots of screams. It was very dark. You could see, like, with a little silhouette shadow of exactly what was happening. Someone all of a sudden took out something really big and started hitting them over the head with it. I immediately started running towards the whole situation.
When the assailant notices Franklin approaching, they take off running.
I ran over to the scene and I saw this woman on the ground. She was really in bad shape. She was completely unresponsive. People started coming out of the apartment building, and I said, "You call 911." I instructed everyone just to call 911. I wanted someone there so I could go chase this guy. He was already a good 15, 20 seconds ahead of me. So I ran after him as fast as I could. As I was catching up to him, he kept looking back, and I was gaining ground. I chased him a long way, and as I got close to him, he went into a very dark alley. It was so dark, I was kind of like walking through the alley with my hands above my head, wondering when he was going to try and hit me. That's when I lost him, because it was extremely dark.
After losing the assailant's trail, Franklin returns to check on the victim and finds Long Beach police have already arrived on the scene.
The initial responding officers found the victim lying in the courtyard outside of an apartment with heavy blunt force trauma injuries about her head and face.
She was in a pool of blood. She was beaten severely.
The victim was unconscious and unresponsive. The fire department immediately gave medical aid.
Neighbors identify the woman as 56-year-old Teresa Keel, a local school teacher who lives in the building with her two adult children, 18-year-old Francesca and 24-year-old Vincent.
Around the same time, Vincent, her son, shows up at the apartment building and sees the commotion and says, "You know, that's my mother."
Vincent told us that he had been out to dinner with his mother earlier in the night. When the attack occurred, a resident that lives in that complex called Vincent right away, and he came to the scene.
It was a miracle she was still alive, and they rushed her to the hospital.
crime scene was established. They began to interview the neighbors to determine who this woman was and what might have happened to her.
Originally from neighboring Queens County, New York, Teresa Ann Albano had dedicated her life to children.
Teresa was very loved by her community, especially the schools in which she taught. She was the teacher that everybody wanted to have. The kids loved her, the parents loved her, and her colleagues loved her.
Terry Keel was just a wonderful woman. Her husband had passed away in 2004. He had been a prominent dentist up in Glen Cove, Long Island. She had basically raised her children single-handedly. That included Vincent and her daughter, Francesca.
She was very dedicated to her two children. She was always there for them when they needed her, especially when their father passed away.
Despite their loss, Francesca and Vincent thrived under their mother's care. While Francesca shined academically, Vincent excelled at sports.
He discovered that he had a real knack for tennis. Vincent went all the way up to tournament levels and was a bit of a tennis phenom in the area. In 2015, Francesca graduated from Long Beach High School. She got a job waitressing, and at the time, her mother encouraged her to go to Nassau Community College to help further her education and open up more opportunities for her, and Francesca did, and she started attending classes there. Vincent was also coming into his own. He was starting to develop apps, and Teresa was 100% in support and was a big champion for Vincent in trying to help him push this forward and get these things done.
She had also earned her doctorate while she was working. She was just a great person.
Teresa had actually been working on creating a tutoring program for the homeless in the area. She was very friendly. She was very willing to help you if you needed help.
But now, the 56-year-old school teacher is clinging to life after a brutal assault. And Long Beach police are trying to piece together what happened.
A review of the crime scene showed that there was a deep gash in the wall close to where Teresa Keel's body was found, indicating that whatever instrument was used to injure Teresa Keel at some point missed her and struck the wall and took a deep gouge out of the wall. Her pocketbook was next to her. Nothing was taken from her pocketbook. Her wallet was still in her pocketbook. So we knew this most likely wasn't a random attack because nothing was missing. The injuries to Teresa Keel's head in particular and the violence of the entire attack led us to believe that this was a personal encounter.
This just spoke of rage, of somebody who had hatred, right, and rage for this woman for whatever reason.
Based on the evidence at the scene, detectives believe Teresa likely knew the perpetrator. But who had attacked her?
Oftentimes you don't have an eyewitness to a crime, but we were really fortunate to have Franklin Kuzma be the eyewitness who happened to be there finishing a workout and who was willing and courageous enough to get involved and actually pursue a guy who had just viciously attacked Teresa Keel.
He was, I'd say about 6'4", maybe 6'3". He was wearing a big hat. He had on a vest, and he had on something that covered his kind of like his bottom chin a little bit, and you really couldn't make out who it was.
When Franklin told us what had happened with chasing this subject, we knew we had to broaden our search.
Long Beach police had K-9 and every officer out there looking for the person who committed this horrific assault because they wanted to make sure that if he was in the area that they could apprehend him safely.
After a period of time elapsed, it appeared that perhaps the person escaped our efforts to locate him, and officers began combing the area for any type of physical evidence, now that we know the route that he took. And in a back alley, over a fence, officers located the weapon. They found the bar from a dumbbell. It did have what appeared to be blood evidence on it, and that was preserved and secured by them.
The weapon was discovered in an alley. I went to that residence and I discovered that there was video in the alley and found that the subject was captured on the video.
Coming up, as the manhunt for the assailant intensifies, police unearth evidence of a stalker.
The GPS tracker had to have been placed on Teresa Keel's car because the movement of the tracker was predominantly between the places where she spent the majority of her time.
In Long Beach, New York, local middle school teacher Teresa Keel is in critical condition after an assault outside her apartment. In their search for the assailant, detectives have discovered home security cameras in a back alley near the crime scene.
I located the owner of the video and downloaded the video and found that the subject was captured on the video, but that for the LED bulbs that light up the video at night were defective. So all we could get was a shadow of the individual.
Detectives secure more security footage in the area and watch as their witness Franklin Kuzma chases the assailant down.
The assailant who was seen on the surveillance video was also carrying a duffel bag. So it's our belief that he changed clothes and took the clothes that he wore during the assault with him.
Unfortunately, detectives can't identify the perp from the footage alone. With little else to go on, detectives head to the hospital to speak with Teresa's family. There, they learn Teresa's prognosis is grim.
Teresa suffered devastating injuries. The right side of her skull was basically caved in.
She is entirely dependent on life support now. She's in a vegetative state.
I responded to the hospital in the wee hours of the morning. We spoke with Vincent Keel at the hospital, and we also spoke with Teresa's brother, Michael.
Vincent and Teresa's brother were extremely, extremely devastated over what happened to Teresa Keel.
When detectives question Teresa's family about the whereabouts of Teresa's daughter, Francesca, Vincent tells them that they haven't been able to get a hold of her. According to Vincent, his sister had moved out 10 months earlier, following a dispute with their family.
Francesca had lost all touch with her family. She did not speak to any of them, including her mother. She had no contact with the family whatsoever.
Suspicious of this new piece of information, detectives ask Vincent to elaborate on the family conflict. He explains that the hostility stemmed from Francesca's relationship with his former friend, 26-year-old Ralph Kepler.
Ralph Kepler was a New York City corrections officer. He was also an entrepreneur. He was very, very interested in starting new businesses and making money off of those businesses.
As one of his ventures, Ralph had invested in a dating app that Vincent Keel was developing.
Vincent and Ralph were very good friends, and based upon their friendship and entrepreneurial spirit, Ralph Kepler and his family invested approximately $130,000 into the app.
Vincent tells police that while they were working together on the app, Ralph had also taken an interest in his 18-year-old sister, Francesca.
She meets Ralph Kepler, who was very handsome, very well-built, and older than her by a few years. And, you know, this handsome older man is lavishing her with attention.
They became romantically involved. Francesca, by all accounts, fell pretty hard for him. She was madly in love with him.
But according to Vincent, the relationship had developed in secret, leading to conflict in the Keel family.
Teresa and Vincent did not approve of Francesca dating Ralph. There was obviously a lot of bad blood.
Vincent and Ralph started to butt heads, and their friendship started to deteriorate.
The worst part, according to Vincent, was that Ralph and his anger had turned Francesca against him.
The more involved with Ralph Kepler that Francesca got, the bigger the rift between Francesca and her mother. And ultimately, Francesca Keel moved out of her mother's house and moved in with Ralph, who lived with his grandfather in a house in Lynbrook.
While Vincent doesn't think his sister is capable of harming their mother, detectives want to talk to her immediately.
The detectives from Long Beach drive up to Lynbrook, to Francesca's home where she lives with Ralph, about 1:30, 1:45 in the morning.
When detectives introduce themselves to Francesca and Ralph, the couple appears surprised to see them.
They bring them to opposite sides of the house and talk to them separately to get their stories about what happened that night.
We spoke to Francesca. I advised her that her mother had been very seriously injured.
And Francesca was stunned into silence. Then the detectives proceeded to ask her, "What were you doing this night? Where were you?"
She conveyed to me that she had been home with Ralph all day, wrapping presents and watching football.
As proof, Francesca produces photos she and Ralph took during the time Teresa was attacked.
She showed us a photo that was time-stamped and date-stamped, seeming to show Ralph Kepler and Francesca Keel wrapping Christmas presents within moments of the brutal assault on Teresa Keel.
Ralph is also talking to the officers on the other side of the house, and he tells them the same things that Francesca told them, that they were wrapping presents and they were watching football, and they have pictures of them wrapping presents to back it up.
He said the only time he left the house was earlier that morning at approximately 11 a.m., and that was to go buy a lottery ticket for his grandfather.
With Ralph and Francesca cleared as persons of interest, detectives aim to gather more information that might lead them to a new suspect. They ask the couple about the recent tension with Teresa. They don't deny it and claim their anger is valid because Teresa had stolen thousands of dollars from investors.
Teresa was soliciting money from people to help fund a Vincent's app. She got tens of thousands of dollars, and Francesca told the police that a lot of people were upset because the app never materialized.
Ralph Kepler and his parents sued Vincent and Terry. There were some other investors involved also, and they wanted their money back.
Francesca was pointing to that as a possible motive for the attack on Teresa.
The Oceanside community of Long Beach, New York is reeling after news has spread that 56-year-old Teresa Keel was viciously assaulted outside of her apartment.
Those injuries were just so overpowering and so dramatic. I just couldn't believe it, frankly. I was just emotionally struck by it, and I broke down, frankly, because, you know, it was just heartbreaking for me.
Detectives are speaking to Teresa's daughter, Francesca, and Francesca's boyfriend, Ralph Kepler, who believe that the attack may be the result of Teresa's recent business dealings.
When they're interviewing Francesca, they ask her, does anyone have a reason to attack your mother? And Francesca tells them that some people are saying that she's a crook who's stealing money from people and using her son's app to line her own pockets.
Ralph Kepler and his parents sued Vincent and Terry. There were some other investors involved also, so that's why she came to me.
Armed with this new information, detectives begin tracking down investors and question them about their dealings with Teresa Keel.
They start speaking to other people who invested in the app just to see if any of them could possibly be part of it.
While detectives confirm that Teresa had faced civil litigation, the investors claim there was no basis for a lawsuit.
The investors basically got their money back, and that case, of course, was dismissed.
There wasn't any sign of animosity between the parties. They were ruled out fairly rapidly as being involved. It was clear it wasn't them at that point. The detectives do look at everybody that potentially could be involved. They look to see what activity's been in the area. They look to see what offenders might have been recently released, who might be doing these type of crimes. But in Long Beach, being a very safe community, there is not a whole lot of that type of activity. The next step is look at phone records and begin methodically plodding through the records. The victim can't speak for herself, so we have to ask her electronic devices to speak for her. Who might have threatened her? What might have happened? We hope that the phone and the analysis of it can provide that information. We found some contentious texts between Ms. Keel and her daughter and her son, indicating that there were problems in the family relationship. Some of these problems appeared to be related to business dealings.
Contrary to Francesca and Ralph's claims, the animosity found in the text messages leads investigators back to Ralph Kepler.
The person who was most angry over the whole money issue was Ralph. And Ralph, of everyone who had lost their money to the app, Ralph was the most aggressive.
Teresa Keel kind of managed the investment money. Ralph Kepler was under the assumption that the money was being misappropriated, and that's where the conflict started. We saw a number of different text messages where he expressed extreme hatred towards Teresa Keel.
Ralph Kepler was sort of blatant in his communications. He was not only threatening them in emails and so forth, but in photographs and other communications.
As detectives continue digging into Teresa's life, they receive more information that Teresa was scared of Ralph.
Friends of Teresa came forward to the police, and one of them had a text message that Teresa had sent her. It said that Francesca had moved in with a psychopath who wanted to, quote, kill her and Vince.
Teresa Keel knew how much Ralph hated her and was concerned that ultimately he was going to harm her or her son, or possibly her daughter.
Detectives immediately secure search warrants for Ralph Kepler and Francesca Keel's cell phones. They look for any information that Ralph was involved, and whether or not Francesca knew about it.
Detectives went through phone records, in particular, Francesca Keel's phone records. One of the detectives actually researched every call that was made in the months leading up to the attack on Teresa Keel.
He came across a 1-800 number, and he looked into what that 1-800 number was, and he saw that it belonged to a company called SpyTech.
They're basically an outfit that sells, among other things, GPS tracking devices. we were able to ask them to provide any information they had regarding purchases made by Ralph Kepler or Francesca Keel. Turns out that a purchase was made by Francesca using her credit card of a GPS device.
The receipt showed that it was delivered by overnight or next day mail and turned on November 25th, 2016. Once the detective learned that a GPS tracking device was purchased by Francesca Keel about 2.5 weeks before her mother's assault, we did a search warrant and we asked the company for the GPS records. When we got the GPS tracking device records and we realized that the GPS tracker had to have been placed on Teresa Keel's car because the movement of the tracker was predominantly between the places where she spent the majority of her time.
The police, using that information, start going through all of Francesca's emails. And they find alerts from the company and the tracking device. And they realize that Francesca had set specific alerts so that she would know when her mother was either at home or at work.
Detectives have to wonder, had Francesca betrayed her mother for her boyfriend? Or is it possible Ralph had made the purchase without Francesca's awareness?
Well, the only person besides Francesca who would have access to her credit card and her email and her passwords was Ralph, who she was living with.
We applied for a warrant for the cell sites for Ralph Kepler's phone and Francesca's phone. We were given Teresa Keel's cell sites, and we had a warrant for the GPS for Spytech. And we put the 4 cell sites together, and we were able to simultaneously look at direction of travel in the car and the other phone numbers associated with Kepler and Francesca's phone.
It was our understanding, based upon some detectives from the Nassau County Electronics Department, that these GPS trackers have batteries, but they don't last forever. You have to take the batteries out and change them every couple days. So there were multiple times when we saw Ralph and Francesca's phone meet up with the GPS, and it was our belief that they were changing the batteries on the GPS to make sure that it would continue to track Teresa Keel's movements. This told us that Francesca, as well as Ralph, were tracking Teresa's movements for weeks leading up to the assault.
Coming up, as police build their case to take down their primary suspects, questions about the crime's true mastermind begin to mount.
The more involved she got with him, the more dependent she got on him.
That was the perfect storm of personalities there, and it turned out to be horrible.
Nearly a month into their investigation, Long Beach, New York police have zeroed in on 18-year-old Francesca Keel and 26-year-old Ralph Kepler as the primary suspects in the attack on Francesca's mother, Teresa Keel. After learning the couple had been tracking Teresa for weeks prior to the assault.
Most investigations are methodical. It's take a record, look it up, find out about it, move on to the next step. This can go on for months. Search warrant process and subpoena process takes time. To apply to a judge for a warrant is a very serious matter. They don't undertake it lightly. So the investigations slow down at this point as we collect information.
Detectives continue digging into Francesca Keel's phone records and find more incriminating evidence.
In addition to the call to the GPS company, there was also a call placed to the Long Beach taxi cab company right around the time of the attack.
Francesca wasn't in Long Beach at the time. When she made the call, her cell sites put her in Lynbrook, where she lived with Ralph Kepler. It was our belief she was calling for a getaway car for Ralph Kepler after the attack.
We're were able to determine the license number and the taxi number of the taxi, and were able to get records from the taxi company.
We did find a cab driver who picked up a male matching Ralph Kepler's description. She said he jumped into the back row, ducked down. She described him as acting very suspicious, very, very paranoid, looking around quite a bit. Told her, take me to the rail, and then paid her, I think it was $18 or $19 for a $5 fare, and jumped out right next to the train station.
To solidify their case, detectives tracked down more surveillance footage from the night of the attack.
From the initial videos, we could see that this subject was a large, stocky individual. He appeared to be very muscular, very strong, but he was very quick.
Ralph Kepler has a very specific body type. He is extremely well built and he's very boxy. He's tall, he's big, but he's also very square. So when you saw the assailant running down the road, there's almost no question that it could be anybody other than Ralph Kepler.
On January 24th, 2018, more than a year after the attack on Teresa Keel, detectives take Ralph Kepler into custody.
Long Beach Police Department detectives arrested Ralph Kepler at his job as a corrections officer at Rikers Island.
Ralph Kepler was arrested and charged with the attempted murder of Teresa Keel.
Now that Ralph was under arrest, we were able to get a court order for a swab of his cheek, and that's what we did.
The DNA sample is sent to the lab to compare with DNA on the bloody barbell found near the scene of the crime. Meanwhile, detectives attempt to speak with Ralph. Unfortunately, he is unwilling to cooperate any further.
Now that I've advised you of your rights, are you willing to answer questions? One attorney present.
At that point, he was brought to court and arraigned on those charges. My office asked that he remain incarcerated during the pendency of the criminal case. The judge did set bail in the amount of $500,000. Ralph Kepler ultimately posted that bail.
Despite their belief that Francesca played a role in the crime, authorities don't have enough evidence to arrest her. But Francesca's friends offer detectives insight into a relationship they claim had turned toxic.
Initially, when Ralph and Francesca started to date, Francesca was still close with her family and very close with her mother. But the more she became involved with Ralph Kepler, the more she started to be pulled away from her family. Ralph would tell her things that her family was against her, that they did not have her best interest at heart, that they were going to take her money. She had an inheritance from her father who passed away, and Ralph made her believe that her family was going to take that inheritance from her.
Francesca's mother worked hard to try to get her back into the family. And I think this caused Ralph Kepler to push even harder to control Francesca. Get her away from the family, basically so he could have complete control of her for himself. She was addicted to Ralph Kepler. She was completely under his control, completely submissive to him. And I think Ralph Kepler, in the end, had Francesca convinced that her mother was a monster.
Finally, in November 2018, detectives received the results from the crime lab.
After the barbell was recovered, it was processed by the lab, and it was determined that Teresa Keel's blood was in fact on that barbell. There were other male profiles that were unknown at the time. So after Ralph was arrested and once that swab was taken, his DNA profile was compared and he matched. point, my office, along with the police department, completed over 24 search warrants for social media, electronic devices, cell phone evidence, computer evidence, just trying to see how deeply Francesca was involved. And we were able to retrieve some internet searches that were done under Francesca Keel's username. And as soon as we read those internet searches, it was game over. There were searches about how reliable is DNA evidence. We found searches about single hit death blows, weakest part of the skull, strongest part of the skull, brain death, how to kill someone and get away with it. There were a tremendous amount of searches.
Then, nearly 2 years after the attack, authorities received tragic news.
On November 10th, 2018, we were notified that Teresa Keel had passed away.
She was beaten severely over the head and really never recovered from those injuries. She was essentially in a vegetative state until ultimately she succumbed to her injuries.
It was a slow and painful way to die. It took years.
When Teresa passed away, after the medical examiner issued their findings, in cooperation with the DA's office, it was determined that we would rearrest Ralph Kepler for murder, and we would also arrest Francesca Keel for murder.
Unfortunately, when she was arrested, she decided against speaking with the police. She had a right to remain silent. She was advised of those rights. She decided to exercise those rights.
Coming up, as the case heads to trial, investigators hope that one of the co-conspirators might turn on the other.
At this point, both sides have articulated bad blood between each other. We have to keep our focus very wide and look for anything that may come up.
2 years after the attack that left Teresa Keel on life support, the 56-year-old school teacher has died, and her daughter Francesca Keel and Francesca's boyfriend Ralph Kepler have been indicted for her murder.
Ralph had managed to apparently turn Francesca from, a devoted daughter into a cold murderer.
That is just over the top insane. Just over the top insane. Well, how do you convince a daughter to kill her mother?
Prosecutors theorize that on the night of December 4th, 2016, Francesca tracked her mother's movements to the diner where she would have her last meal with Vincent.
She would have got a geo alert when they got there, but they would have known when she left the diner as well because the cars tracked continuously.
So knowing that she was there and that Teresa would soon be going home, Francesca ordered the cab to take Ralph to the apartment where he would lie in wait for Teresa and then attack her.
At the same time, Francesca used both her and Ralph's phones to establish an alibi.
What we think happened was that they'd taken a picture in a social media platform and left it up in, say, the cloud. And then what happened was right after the incident, Francesca would have taken those pictures from that social media platform, taken it down to both phones, and saved the picture to the camera roll. I believe that there were burner phones involved and that one had called the other from these burner phones. During that time, after he said whatever he said to her, whether it's a code or he said he did it, I don't know. She then took her phone and his phone and downloaded these pictures from this third-party cloud app and then saved them onto both phones at the same time.
She sat there and waited for the moment when her mom was going to die to create an alibi. She had an opportunity to pick up a phone. She had an opportunity to stop him. She had an opportunity to say, "Don't do this to my mother." She elected not to do any of those things and to provide an alibi for her boyfriend. She's 100% part of this crime.
In December 2019, the state meets with Ralph's defense team to discuss a plea agreement.
The detectives found those extremely important internet searches. It was my job to make sure that the defense attorney knew about them right away. And as soon as we went to court, and I informed the court as well as the defense attorney as to the amount of and the content of the internet searches, that is when, shortly thereafter, Ralph had agreed to plead guilty.
Ralph accepted a sentence of 22 years to life. The maximum sentence for murder in the second degree in New York would be 25 to life. In exchange for his agreement to plead guilty, the judge gave him a commitment that he would basically save 3 years and be sentenced to 22 years to life. He will have to do at least 22 years behind bars and could potentially spend the rest of his life behind bars.
My office ultimately offered Francesca a plea to manslaughter in the first degree, as long as it was conditioned upon her serving 13 years in jail. And once we made that offer to Francesca, she accepted it soon thereafter.
It was shocking to me that it got to the point where Francesca was willing to serve her own mother up on a silver platter to Ralph Kepler.
Their hatred for this woman, somebody who was well-loved by the community, someone who was well-loved by her family, someone who was well-loved by the children that she taught, that's what ultimately led to her violent death.
She was just a great person. She really was, and did not deserve to die.
If those two never got together, if they never dated, Teresa Keel would be alive today.
January 1992. Somewhere inside a locked workshop in rural England, a young woman lay trapped in total darkness. She could not see the walls around her. She could barely move her arms. The air inside the narrow wooden container felt stale and heavy, thick with the smell of timber, metal, and damp concrete drifting in from somewhere beyond the box. Every sound mattered now, every vibration, every creak in the floorboards overhead. Somewhere nearby, machinery existed in silence. Tools hung untouched. Pipes rattled faintly in the cold winter air. And every so often, footsteps approached through the darkness with slow, measured precision. The woman inside the box was 25-year-old estate agent Stephanie Slater. 8 days earlier, she had left work expecting to show a vacant property to a potential buyer. Instead, she vanished into a nightmare carefully constructed by a man who believed he could engineer the perfect crime. The wooden box that imprisoned Stephanie was not improvised in panic. It had been designed, built, tested, prepared in advance long before she ever entered it. The man responsible had equipped it with restraints, locks, hidden alarms, safeguards against escape. It resembled less a spontaneous kidnapping and more an industrial project assembled by someone obsessed with control. In many true crime stories, violence erupts out of chaos, anger, or impulse. But the Michael Sams case was different. What made investigators uneasy was not only the brutality of the crimes, but the patience behind them. Every movement appeared calculated. Every risk had been considered. Every instruction rehearsed. Michael Sams was not a criminal who stumbled into violence. He pursued it methodically with the detached focus of someone solving a technical problem. And inside that workshop, while Stephanie struggled to understand whether she would survive the night, her kidnapper moved with chilling calmness. Later accounts would reveal that Sams often spoke in an unexpectedly controlled tone. He was not frantic. He was not shouting. At times, he even appeared conversational. That contrast would become one of the most disturbing elements of the entire case, because the same man who chained women inside coffin-like boxes also behaved as though he were managing a carefully organized operation. Stephanie would later remember fragments of sound more clearly than images. The scrape of locks, the opening of heavy doors, the sound of an old-style rotary telephone somewhere in the building. In prolonged darkness, the human mind begins attaching itself to details that might otherwise seem meaningless. A distant footstep becomes a clue. A metallic click becomes evidence. A voice becomes the only remaining connection to the outside world. At some point during those 8 days, Stephanie realized something horrifying. The man holding her captive had prepared for this long before he chose her. The box existed before her arrival. The restraints existed before her arrival. The workshop had already been transformed into a private prison before she ever walked into that empty property in Birmingham. That realization changed the nature of the fear entirely. Because random violence carries one kind of terror, planned violence carries another. Planned violence means intention. It means rehearsal. It means the offender has spent time imagining exactly how another human being will suffer. And Michael Sams had imagined this in extraordinary detail. Across Britain, newspapers would eventually describe him as one of the country's most notorious kidnappers. Detectives would later compare the sophistication of his ransom operation to something far beyond the capabilities expected from a lone offender. Yet at the center of the story was not a criminal mastermind in the cinematic sense. Michael Sams was outwardly, painfully ordinary. Born in Yorkshire in 1941, he worked as a mechanic and heating engineer. He lived quietly in Sutton-on-Trent, Nottinghamshire. Neighbors did not see a theatrical villain. They saw a middle-aged tradesman, someone practical, technically skilled, reserved. The ordinary exterior became part of the horror, because cases like this force investigators and the public alike to confront an uncomfortable reality. Some of the most dangerous offenders are not visibly monstrous. They blend into ordinary life. They repair boilers, drive familiar roads, speak calmly, go unnoticed. Long before Stephanie Slater disappeared, another young woman had already crossed paths with Michael Sams. Her name was Julie Dart. She was 18 years old. In July of 1991, roughly 6 months before Stephanie's abduction, Julie vanished after encountering Sams in Leeds. Like Stephanie, she was taken to the same hidden environment of confinement and control. Like Stephanie, she was blindfolded and restrained. But Julie Dart would never leave alive. According to Sam's later confession, Julie attempted to escape from the wooden box where she was imprisoned. She tried to break free, but the box had been fitted with an alarm system specifically designed to warn him if she escaped. The very existence of such a system revealed how deeply premeditated the crimes truly were. Sams was not merely abducting victims. He was engineering captivity itself. Julie was eventually forced to write a ransom letter demanding money from her boyfriend. Investigators would later believe there was little evidence Sams ever intended to release her. Afterward, he murdered her with a hammer and disposed of her body in a field in Lincolnshire. Her killing launched one of West Yorkshire Police's largest investigations since the Yorkshire Ripper era. Yet despite enormous effort, detectives initially had almost nothing to work with. No obvious suspect, no reliable trail, no understanding that the offender would strike again. And meanwhile, somewhere quietly hidden behind the appearance of normal life, Michael Sams continued preparing. Cases involving ransom kidnappings were relatively rare in Britain during the early 1990s. The country had not yet entered the era of modern digital surveillance. CCTV coverage was limited. Mobile phones were uncommon. Investigators still relied heavily on physical observation, public cooperation, handwriting analysis, forensic traces, and telephone records that could be painfully slow to track. Sams understood this landscape well. He exploited public telephone boxes. He changed instructions repeatedly. He planned routes carefully. He studied how police responded to pressure. What terrified investigators later was the realization that he had educated himself through observation and patience. He appeared fascinated by the mechanics of criminal investigation itself. Prosecutors at trial would later argue that Michael Sams wanted to prove he could commit a perfect kidnapping, not simply a successful one, a perfect one executed with enough precision to outmaneuver police entirely. That obsession shaped every stage of his crimes. Yet perfection in criminal cases is usually an illusion. Human beings make mistakes. Patterns emerge. Tiny details survive. And sometimes, after elaborate planning, an investigation breaks open through something unexpectedly simple. A familiar voice, a remembered sound, a surviving witness. But at the beginning of 1992, none of that had happened yet. Stephanie Slater remained trapped inside darkness, uncertain whether she would become another body abandoned somewhere in the English countryside. For her family, the disappearance was sudden and incomprehensible. One ordinary work appointment had become a national kidnapping case. Somewhere beyond the walls of that workshop, police scrambled to understand who had taken her and why. Yet even while the investigation unfolded, Michael Sams maintained a disturbing level of composure. He issued ransom demands, manipulated communication, directed complex exchanges through public telephones. And all the while, he kept a living human being locked inside a coffin-like container hidden in his workshop. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the case is not simply the violence itself, but the coexistence of brutality and routine. During the day, Britain continued moving normally. Cars filled roads. Offices opened. Families watched television. Estate agencies conducted business as usual. And hidden quietly within that ordinary world was a man carefully managing the logistics of kidnapping, extortion, and imprisonment. In retrospect, investigators would uncover evidence revealing how deeply distorted Sam's thinking had become. After his arrest, police discovered diary entries in which he described holding Stephanie's hand and feeling emotionally attached to her. The writings suggested a profoundly warped understanding of intimacy and control. To Sams, captivity itself appeared entangled with emotional fantasy. This contradiction would later horrify both detectives and the public, because the crimes were not acts of sudden madness. They emerged from a mind capable of planning, compartmentalization, and self-justification all at once. The Michael Sams case is often remembered because of its sophistication. The hidden workshop, the ransom operation, the carefully planned communication strategy. But beneath all of those details lies something much more human and far more tragic. A young woman named Julie Dart lost her life inside a system of captivity she never had any realistic chance of escaping. Another woman, Stephanie Slater, survived 8 days of psychological terror and carried those scars for decades afterward. And at the center stood a man obsessed with control, convinced he could outthink everyone around him. Over time, investigators would dismantle the illusion piece by piece. But before the arrests, before the courtroom, before the headlines that would spread across Britain, there was only darkness inside a wooden box and the sound of footsteps approaching slowly through a cold workshop floor. To understand the Michael Sams case, it is important to understand the Britain in which these crimes unfolded. Early 1990s England existed in a strange space between the old world and the modern one. Much of daily life still relied on systems that now seem distant. Public telephone boxes stood on street corners across cities and small towns. Handwritten notes remained common in both business and personal communication. Surveillance cameras were limited mostly to banks, certain shops, and a handful of city centers. Mobile phones were rare and expensive. Investigations moved more slowly because information itself moved more slowly. Detectives still depended heavily on interviews, paper records, eyewitnesses, and physical observation. A person could disappear for hours before concern escalated. A stranger could make repeated anonymous phone calls from different public booths without leaving. Behind the kind of digital trail that would exist today, that environment mattered deeply in the Michael Sams investigation because Sams understood the weaknesses of the era. He recognized how fragmented communication systems were. He understood that police coordination across regions could be difficult. He knew investigators could not instantly trace every movement or reconstruct every interaction. And perhaps most importantly, he understood how anonymity could still exist inside ordinary British life. The crimes also unfolded under the lingering shadow of earlier violent cases that had shaken Northern England during the previous decades. The Yorkshire Ripper investigation, in particular, had left a lasting scar on public consciousness and police culture. Communities still remembered the fear that had spread through cities and towns as women disappeared, and bodies were discovered across Yorkshire. By the early 1990s, there remained widespread anxiety around violence against women, especially cases involving vulnerable victims whose disappearances could initially be overlooked or misunderstood. That fear would become painfully relevant in July 1991 when 18-year-old Julie Dart vanished. Julie's life, as presented in the available records, reflects a tragic vulnerability that often appears in true crime cases involving marginalized young women. She was only 18 years old when she encountered Michael Sams in Leeds. The details preserved publicly are limited, and it is important not to fictionalize her personality or experiences beyond the available evidence. But what remains painfully clear is how exposed she was within the social environment surrounding her. Investigators later believed Sams deliberately selected someone who could disappear without immediately triggering the same level of public alarm that might accompany victims from more protected or visible backgrounds. There is a deeply uncomfortable reality in many criminal investigations. Offenders sometimes target people they believe society will fail to protect quickly. Vulnerability becomes opportunity in the eyes of predators. In Julie Dart's case, detectives would later suspect that Michael Sams never intended for her to survive at all. The ransom demand forced upon her may have functioned less as a genuine financial operation and more as part of Sam's broader fantasy of control and manipulation. But before any of those conclusions emerged, Julie was simply a young woman whose life intersected with a man already constructing the mechanics of captivity in secret. When people discuss notorious criminal cases years later, victims can easily become secondary to the offender's name. But in reality, before headlines and investigations, Julie Dart existed as a human being moving through ordinary life. She was 18, young enough that most of adulthood still lay ahead of her. Young enough that the violence waiting for her on that July day was impossible to imagine. Her disappearance initiated enormous concern for police, but the case immediately faced challenges. There were few reliable leads, few witnesses, few connections pointing clearly toward a suspect. The offender had selected isolation carefully. And somewhere far from public view, inside a hidden workshop, Michael Sams continued refining the methods he would later use again. The second woman drawn into Sam's carefully constructed world came from a very different background. Stephanie Slater was 25 years old and working as an estate agent in Birmingham. Her life reflected another ordinary aspect of early 1990s Britain. Professional women increasingly working independently in customer-facing jobs that require trust in strangers. Estate agents frequently conducted property viewings alone. They met unfamiliar clients. They entered empty homes. They spent time in isolated spaces with people they had never previously encountered. In most situations, these routines remained entirely safe. But the structure of the job depended on assumptions about normal human behavior. Michael Sams exploited those assumptions with terrifying precision. Before Stephanie ever met him, he had already begun constructing the deception that would place her in danger. He called the estate agency, pretending to be a prospective buyer interested in viewing property. Nothing about the interaction initially appeared extraordinary. It resembled hundreds of legitimate business calls handled by agencies every week across Britain. That normality is what makes the case so disturbing in retrospect. Stephanie did not walk knowingly into danger. She followed routine professional procedure. She arrived for work expecting another ordinary day. The property she was assigned to show stood empty on Turnberry Road in Birmingham. Empty houses create silence unlike ordinary homes. No televisions, no conversation, no movement behind walls, just stillness. For estate agents, however, empty properties were normal workplaces. Stephanie entered that environment expecting to guide a client through a viewing. Instead, according to the evidence later presented, Michael Sams produced a knife and immediately took control. The transformation from ordinary working day to violent abduction happened in moments. One of the recurring themes throughout the Michael Sams case is the fragility of normal routines. Julie Dart entered a stranger's vehicle. Stephanie Slater attended a scheduled property viewing. Neither event initially carried obvious signs of catastrophe. Yet behind those ordinary moments stood an offender who had already invested enormous effort into preparation. That preparation is central to understanding Michael Sams himself. Born in Yorkshire in 1941, Sams appeared outwardly unremarkable for much of his adult life. He worked as a mechanic and heating engineer, occupations demanding practical intelligence and technical skill. People who encountered him in daily life did not describe an obviously chaotic or unstable individual. Instead, his personality outwardly reflected discipline, structure, and competence. Those qualities became deeply dangerous when directed toward criminal obsession. Prosecutors later argued that Sams wanted to prove he could commit the perfect kidnapping, not merely a successful crime, but one engineered so carefully that police would fail to stop him. Unlike impulsive offenders driven by sudden rage, Sams demonstrated extensive preparation over time. He transformed a workshop in Newark into a hidden confinement site. He built coffin-like wooden boxes specifically designed to imprison victims. He installed alarm systems to detect escape attempts. He prepared handwritten ransom notes. He studied police responses. He planned communication strategies involving public telephones and shifting instructions. Everything about the operation suggested prolonged rehearsal and obsessive planning. Investigators later expressed particular shock at the fact that Sams appeared to operate alone. The sophistication of the kidnappings initially led some to suspect multiple offenders might be involved. Yet much of the planning, transport, communication, and imprisonment had been orchestrated by one man. That realization forced detectives to confront how dangerous a technically skilled and highly organized individual could become when combined with emotional detachment and criminal fixation. There is also something psychologically revealing about the physical environment Sams created. The workshop was not simply a hiding place. It was a controlled system. The wooden coffin-like boxes symbolized total domination over another human being. Victims could not see their surroundings, could not measure time, could not orient themselves spatially. The alarms prevented escape. The restraints removed movement. The environment stripped away autonomy piece by piece. Everything inside the workshop existed to reinforce helplessness. And yet, outside that hidden space, Sams continued living within ordinary society. This dual existence often becomes one of the most unsettling aspects of organized offenders. Neighbors may see routine behavior, while unimaginable acts occur privately nearby. Michael Sams repaired heating systems and maintained the outward appearance of normal life while secretly constructing a prison for future victims. The contrast between those realities remains difficult to process even decades later. It is tempting, in retrospect, to search for obvious warning signs that would have revealed what he intended to do. But cases like this rarely provide simple answers. Many organized offenders survive precisely because they understand social expectations and learn how to appear unremarkable. The myth of visibly identifiable evil often collapses in real criminal investigations. Michael Sams did not present himself as a cinematic villain. He presented himself as ordinary. That ordinariness gave him access to freedom, mobility, and trust. By the time Stephanie Slater entered the empty property on Turnberry Road in January 1992, Michael Sams had already spent months refining methods of abduction and control. Julie Dart had already died. Police were already struggling with unanswered questions. Yet no one standing in that Birmingham house could have fully understood how much preparation existed behind the man posing as a property buyer. The kidnapping that followed would soon become one of Britain's most infamous ransom investigations. But before investigators uncovered hidden workshops, ransom notes, or carefully designed escape alarms, there were simply two women whose lives collided with a man obsessed with domination, secrecy, and the illusion of criminal perfection. On July 9, 1991, Michael Sams drove into Leeds searching for a victim. By that point, much of the infrastructure for his crimes already existed. The workshop had been prepared. The confinement box had been built. The alarm systems were in place. The restraints were ready. What remained uncertain was only the identity of the person who would eventually become trapped. Inside that environment, somewhere within the city that day, 18-year-old Julie Dart encountered him. The details that followed would later emerge through investigation and Sam's own admissions after conviction. Julie entered Sam's vehicle and was quickly placed under his control. He blindfolded her and transported her away from Leeds toward the hidden workshop that functioned as the center of his operation. It is difficult to fully imagine the psychological terror of those moments. Blindfolding removes orientation almost instantly. Time becomes distorted. Distances become impossible to estimate. Every turn of the vehicle creates uncertainty. Victims lose not only physical freedom, but also their ability to understand where they are being taken or what is happening around them. By the time Julie arrived at the workshop, Michael Sams had already transformed the location into something far more disturbing than a simple hiding place. Inside waited a coffin-like wooden box designed specifically for human confinement. According to the evidence later presented, Julie was placed inside it and chained down. The box itself symbolized the calculated nature of the crime. This was not an improvised prison assembled in panic. It had been constructed in advance, with clear anticipation that another human being would eventually occupy it. The design reflected obsession with control rather than spontaneous violence. Everything about the environment was intended to eliminate autonomy. Darkness restricted perception. Restraints restricted movement. Isolation restricted hope. One of the most chilling details later uncovered involved the alarm system attached to the box. Sams had engineered a mechanism capable of alerting him if the container was tampered with or opened. The implication was horrifyingly clear. He expected escape attempts. He anticipated resistance. He designed the environment accordingly. According to Sam's later confession, Julie eventually attempted to break free. Even within captivity, survival instincts remain powerful. Human beings continue searching for escape, even in conditions that appear hopeless. Somewhere inside that workshop, trapped inside darkness and confinement, Julie tried to destroy the box, imprisoning her. But the alarm system functioned exactly as intended. Sams discovered the attempt. Afterward, according to his account, he tied Julie to a roof beam within the workshop. The progression of the crime reveals something deeply disturbing about Sam's mindset. At each stage, he responded not emotionally, but mechanically. Escape attempts became problems to solve. Resistance became another logistical issue requiring correction. This emotional detachment would later become central to how investigators and prosecutors understood his behavior. The violence did not appear chaotic. It appeared procedural. On the following day, Sams forced Julie to write a ransom letter demanding £140,000 from her boyfriend. Investigators later questioned whether the ransom demand had ever represented a genuine intention to negotiate for release. Many believe Sams selected Julie precisely because she occupied a vulnerable position within society and could disappear with limited immediate visibility. In that interpretation, the ransom letter functioned more as part of his fantasy of criminal sophistication than as a serious financial plan. It reinforced his self-image as an orchestrator of complex crimes. The psychological aspect of forcing a captive victim to participate in her own ransom demand also reflected another layer of domination. The victim becomes part of the machinery of the crime itself. But whatever motivations existed behind the letter, the ending remained brutally simple. After forcing Julie to write it, Michael Sams murdered her with a hammer. The violence itself was horrifying, but what followed revealed once again the organized nature of his actions. He wrapped Julie's body in bedsheets and disposed of her remains in a field in Lincolnshire. Even after murder, he continued acting methodically. Evidence had to be concealed. Distances had to be managed. Locations had to be selected carefully. The crime scene extended far beyond the workshop itself. When Julie Dart disappeared and her body was eventually discovered, police launched a major investigation. The case generated enormous concern within West Yorkshire Police, partly because Northern England still carried deep institutional memories of earlier serial investigations. Detectives understood how devastating unsolved violence against women could become both for public trust and for the victims' families. Yet despite extensive effort, the investigation struggled almost immediately. There were few direct leads. No obvious suspect emerged. The offender had minimized exposure carefully. At that stage, investigators did not yet understand that the same man would strike again months later with even greater sophistication. While police searched for answers, Michael Sams continued living outwardly ordinary life. That duality became one of the defining characteristics of the case. A man capable of constructing a private prison and murdering a young woman still maintained the external routines of normal existence. The hidden nature of organized offenders often creates a uniquely unsettling kind of fear because it reveals how effectively violence can coexist with apparent normality. 6 months later, on January 22, 1992, Sams began the second major crime that would ultimately expose him. This time, the target was 25-year-old estate agent Stephanie Slater. Unlike Julie Dart, Stephanie entered the situation through what appeared to be an entirely legitimate professional appointment. Michael Sams contacted the Shipways estate agency pretending to be a prospective homebuyer, interested in viewing property. The call itself raised no immediate alarm. Estate agents routinely arranged viewings with unfamiliar clients. Empty houses were shown every day to strangers seeking potential purchases. Sams understood this process well enough to exploit it perfectly. Stephanie was assigned to meet the supposed buyer at a vacant property on Turnberry Road in Birmingham. Nothing about the appointment initially distinguished it from countless other workday interactions. That ordinariness would later haunt the public understanding of the case. Violence did not erupt from obviously suspicious circumstances. It emerged from routine trust. When Stephanie arrived at the property and entered the empty house with Sams, he suddenly produced a knife and took control. The speed with which ordinary life collapsed into terror was devastating. Within moments, Stephanie was restrained, blindfolded, and removed from the property. The isolation of the empty house worked in Sam's favor exactly as intended. There were no witnesses inside, no immediate interruption, no chance for escape once the attack began. He transported her to the same workshop environment used during Julie Dart's captivity months. Earlier, by now, the workshop had become the physical center of Sam's fantasy of control. Stephanie was placed inside another coffin-like container, reportedly positioned horizontally within a large bin structure. The conditions of her confinement would later become central to understanding the psychological brutality of the case. For 8 days, Stephanie lived inside near total darkness. She was frequently gagged, restrained, released only occasionally for basic necessities such as food. Time itself became difficult to measure. Human beings rely on light, movement, conversation, and environmental change to maintain psychological orientation. Deprived of those elements, the mind begins deteriorating into confusion and fear. Stephanie later described living in almost complete isolation throughout the captivity. The physical confinement was terrifying enough, but the uncertainty surrounding survival may have been even worse. Julie Dart had not survived the same environment months earlier, though Stephanie did not yet know that. She could not know whether release was planned or whether she would eventually disappear without trace. One of the most sensitive aspects of the case involves Stephanie's later statements indicating that Sams raped her on the first night of captivity. The allegation added another dimension to the violence already unfolding inside the workshop. Sexual violence in kidnapping cases often functions not simply as physical assault, but as another mechanism of domination and psychological destruction. It reinforces the offender's total control over the victim's body, movement, and identity. Throughout the captivity, Sams maintained the same disturbing composure that would later define public understanding of him. He issued instructions calmly. He managed the ransom operation systematically. And outside the hidden workshop, one of the most complex kidnapping investigations in modern British history began unfolding. Sams demanded £175,000 from the Shipways estate agency in exchange for Stephanie's release. What stunned investigators was the sophistication of the communication strategy. Sams relied heavily on public telephone boxes, changing locations repeatedly and making tracing efforts extraordinarily difficult. He altered instructions frequently, forcing police and intermediaries into constant reactive movement. He appeared highly aware of surveillance concerns and constructed elaborate collection procedures designed to confuse investigators. The ransom operation revealed how carefully he had studied procedure and timing. He seemed fascinated not only with kidnapping itself, but with the challenge of manipulating police behavior. During the eventual ransom exchange, Sam succeeded in misleading surveillance teams and temporarily disappearing with the money despite intensive police involvement. Investigators later described the operation as one of the most sophisticated ransom schemes carried out by a lone offender in Britain at the time. Yet the disturbing contradictions within Sam's behavior continued even after the ransom collection succeeded. Eventually, he released Stephanie near her parents' home in Great Bar. Before leaving, according to later accounts, he apologized to her and told her to try rebuilding her life. The statement reflected the same warped psychological contradiction investigators would later discover in his diary writings. Sams appeared capable of extreme cruelty while simultaneously framing himself as emotionally connected to his victims. The coexistence of calculated imprisonment and gestures resembling sympathy created profound unease among those who studied the case afterward. For Stephanie, survival did not mean escape from trauma. After 8 days in captivity, she emerged physically alive but psychologically scarred by prolonged confinement, terror, and uncertainty. Cases involving kidnapping often leave victims carrying invisible consequences for years afterward. The body may survive while the mind continues replaying isolation, helplessness, and fear indefinitely. Meanwhile, police faced enormous pressure to identify the offender responsible for both the ransom operation and the earlier unsolved murder of Julie Dart. At that point, however, Michael Sams still remained hidden behind the appearance of an ordinary middle-aged tradesman living quietly in England. He had come terrifyingly close to constructing the crime he believed could never be solved. By the time Stephanie Slater was released in early 1992, British investigators understood they were dealing with an offender unlike most kidnappers they had encountered before. The case was not unfolding through impulsive violence or obvious recklessness. Instead, every stage suggested planning, patience, and technical awareness. The ransom demands had been carefully coordinated. Telephone communications had been deliberately fragmented across multiple public call boxes. Instructions shifted constantly, forcing investigators to react rather than anticipate. Surveillance teams struggled to maintain control because the offender appeared to understand investigative procedure unusually well. For detectives, one of the most frustrating aspects of the case was the realization that Michael Sams operated within the limitations of the era almost perfectly. In the early 1990s, tracing telephone calls was far slower and more complicated than modern audiences often imagine. Public telephones created layers of anonymity that offenders could exploit if they remained mobile. CCTV systems were limited. Automatic digital tracking did not yet dominate daily life. A determined individual willing to plan carefully could still create significant gaps in visibility. Sams exploited every one of those weaknesses. During the ransom operation involving Stephanie Slater, police were repeatedly forced into defensive positions. Instructions changed rapidly. Locations shifted. Timelines evolved unexpectedly. Officers attempting surveillance risked exposing themselves at every stage. The pressure was enormous because the life of a hostage depended on every decision investigators made. If police acted too aggressively, they risked provoking the offender. If they acted too cautiously, they risked allowing him to disappear entirely. Meanwhile, somewhere hidden from public view, Stephanie remained imprisoned inside the workshop. Her survival depended not only on her endurance, but also on whether investigators could understand the man controlling the situation. Yet in many ways, the most important breakthrough in the entire case would not emerge from technology or dramatic forensic discoveries. It would emerge from memory. Human memory, particularly after trauma, is imperfect. Investigators understand this well. Witnesses can forget timelines, distort details, or misinterpret events under stress. But trauma can also sharpen certain sensory experiences with extraordinary clarity. Survivors often remember isolated fragments that become psychologically fixed because the brain attaches itself desperately to anything capable of creating orientation during terror. Stephanie Slater became crucial to the investigation precisely because she survived long enough to absorb details about her environment. During captivity, she had been deprived of vision for much of the time, but the absence of sight intensified other senses. She remembered sounds. She remembered patterns. She remembered the feeling of movement inside the building and the mechanical character of the environment surrounding her. Among the details she later described were the sounds of heavy doors, workshop-like surroundings, and most importantly, the distinctive noise of an old rotary telephone. At first glance, such details may appear minor, but experienced investigators understand that cases often break open through combinations of seemingly insignificant observations. A sound remembered by a survivor can narrow environments dramatically. A mechanical noise can suggest occupation, building type, or age of equipment. Stephanie's recollections became valuable because they reflected genuine sensory experience rather than speculation. She was not inventing dramatic narratives. She was describing fragments of reality preserved through fear. While detectives continued analyzing evidence connected to Stephanie's kidnapping, they also revisited the unsolved murder of Julie Dart. Increasingly, similarities between the two crimes became difficult to ignore. Both involved calculated abduction. Both reflected organized restraint and confinement. Both suggested an offender fascinated by domination and control. And both displayed unusual levels of preparation. Investigators began considering whether the same man might be responsible for both cases. If true, that possibility changed the stakes entirely. They were no longer searching only for a kidnapper. They were searching for a murderer capable of repeated, carefully engineered violence. The investigation intensified. Detectives reviewed communications repeatedly. Handwriting analysis became increasingly important. The ransom notes displayed patterns that investigators hoped might eventually connect to a suspect. Spelling mistakes, phrasing habits, and writing characteristics all became pieces of a larger puzzle. In organized criminal investigations, offenders often believe they are controlling communication entirely. Yet language itself can betray identity. Small habits repeated unconsciously across documents can reveal consistency investigators learn to recognize over time. Still, despite mounting pressure and expanding analysis, police initially lacked the decisive breakthrough needed to identify Michael Sams directly. Then came one of the most important moments in the entire investigation. The release of an audio recording to the public through the BBC television program Crime Watch. Crime Watch occupied a unique role in British criminal investigations during that era. The program reconstructed crimes, presented evidence, and appealed directly to viewers for assistance. Before the age of social media and instant digital distribution, national television broadcasts could mobilize enormous public attention. In the Michael Sams case, investigators decided to release recordings of the kidnapper's voice in hopes that someone might recognize it. It was a calculated risk. Public exposure could generate false leads and confusion, but detectives believed the voice itself might contain the clue they desperately needed. And remarkably, it did. Among the people watching the broadcast were members of Michael Sams' own family. His ex-wife and son reportedly recognized the voice almost immediately and contacted authorities. The moment carries enormous emotional weight when viewed in retrospect. Imagine hearing a national broadcast connected to kidnapping and extortion, only to slowly realize the voice belongs to someone intimately familiar. Recognition in such situations is not merely intellectual. It is deeply personal and psychologically devastating. For investigators, however, the call changed everything. The inquiry now had a concrete direction. Detective Bob Taylor emerged as one of the central figures in pursuing the new lead. Taylor and his team began focusing intensely on Michael Sams, examining whether the evidence already collected aligned with the possibility that this outwardly ordinary heating engineer was responsible for both the kidnapping of Stephanie Slater and the murder of Julie Dart. Once investigators concentrated on Sams, patterns began emerging with increasing clarity. Stephanie's memories about the workshop environment became more significant. The sound she recalled matched aspects of locations connected to Sams. The rotary telephone noise fit the type of equipment associated with him. Gradually, Sensory fragments from Stephanie's captivity started aligning with physical realities investigators could verify. Handwriting analysis also strengthened suspicion. The ransom notes displayed similarities connected to Sam's writing style, including spelling characteristics and recurring patterns. In criminal investigations, handwriting evidence alone rarely resolves cases completely, but combined with other material, it can become highly persuasive. Detectives were no longer dealing with isolated coincidences. They were building convergence. Multiple independent details pointed toward the same individual. Forensic evidence further tightened the case. Investigators uncovered material linking Sam's to Julie Dart's murder. Although the publicly available details regarding all forensic findings remain limited in comparison to modern cases, what mattered most was cumulative weight. Individually, certain pieces of evidence might have remained ambiguous. Together, they formed a coherent picture. This cumulative process is often how major criminal investigations succeed. Rarely does a single dramatic revelation solve everything instantly. Instead, detectives assemble dozens of fragments until denial becomes increasingly difficult. Meanwhile, psychological understanding of Michael Sams deepened as investigators examined his behavior more closely. He did not fit simplistic stereotypes of chaotic violence. His crimes reflected organization, compartmentalization, and emotional distortion. The workshop itself became central evidence of intent and planning. The coffin-like boxes, restraint systems, and alarm mechanisms demonstrated prolonged preparation incompatible with spontaneous offending. These are not temporary improvisations. They were engineered systems designed for captivity. When Sams was eventually arrested, investigators encountered a man who reportedly remained composed rather than openly hysterical or erratic. That composure itself became unsettling. He appeared to view much of his operation through the lens of technical achievement. Prosecutors later argued that he was obsessed with proving his ability to execute the perfect crime. The ransom strategies, communication systems, and confinement methods all supported that interpretation. Yet perhaps the most disturbing discoveries emerged through his personal writings. Police found diary entries in which Sams described holding Stephanie's hand, hugging her, and feeling emotionally attached to her during captivity. These writings exposed the deeply warped psychology underlying the crimes. To outside observers, the contradiction was horrifying. How could someone in prison terrorize and allegedly sexually assault another human being while simultaneously framing the relationship in emotional terms? But such contradictions are not uncommon among coercive offenders. Control becomes distorted into intimacy. Domination becomes rationalized as connection. The victim's suffering becomes psychologically minimized inside the offender's fantasy structure. Investigators studying the case recognized that the diaries revealed not empathy, but narcissistic delusion. Stephanie existed in Sam's writings less as an autonomous person and more as a figure within his internal fantasy of control and emotional significance. The same man who engineered coffin-like imprisonment also imagined himself emotionally bonded to the person trapped inside it. As evidence mounted, the illusion of the perfect crime began collapsing. Michael Sams had invested enormous effort into secrecy and operational precision. For a time, he succeeded in creating confusion and distance between himself and investigators. But organized offenders often underestimate one critical factor. Human beings leave traces not only through physical evidence, but through relationships, habits, language, and memory. Sam's downfall emerged from a combination of survivor testimony, forensic investigation, handwriting analysis, and, perhaps most ironically, recognition by people who knew him personally. The voice broadcast intended for millions of strangers ultimately mattered because it reached Familiar ears. Behind all the sophisticated planning, hidden workshops, and ransom strategies stood a man whose own family recognized him instantly. And once investigators focused fully on Michael Sams, the structure he had spent so long constructing began to unravel piece by piece. In 1993, the case against Michael Sams arrived at Nottingham Crown Court. By then, the investigation had transformed public understanding of the crimes from isolated acts of violence into something far more calculated and disturbing. What prosecutors prepared to present was not merely a kidnapping case or a murder case in isolation, but the portrait of a man who had methodically constructed systems of captivity and extortion while maintaining the outward appearance of an ordinary working life. The charges against Sams reflected the breadth of the allegations. He faced accusations connected to the kidnapping of Stephanie Slater, the murder of Julie Dart, blackmail, false imprisonment, and related offenses arising from the ransom operation that had gripped national attention. By the time proceedings began, Britain already knew the broad outlines of the story. Newspapers had covered the shocking details of the confinement box, the ransom communications, and the survival of Stephanie Slater. But trials introduce a different kind of confrontation with violence. Public headlines simplify events into summaries. Courtrooms force evidence into sequence. Piece by piece, detail by detail, the structure of the crimes becomes impossible to avoid. The prosecution's case relied heavily on demonstrating planning and continuity. Investigators believed the crimes were not disconnected acts, but manifestations of a single, organized methodology developed and refined by Michael Sams himself. The hidden workshop became one of the central symbols presented in court. It represented preparation, intention, and prolonged psychological control. The existence of confinement boxes, restraints, and alarm systems undermined any possibility that these crimes could be dismissed as spontaneous or accidental. Everything inside that environment reflected advanced design. One of the most important aspects of the trial involved Sam's own legal strategy. He admitted to kidnapping Stephanie Slater. That admission mattered because it eliminated any serious dispute about his involvement in the ransom operation and unlawful imprisonment. Yet despite acknowledging the kidnapping, Sams denied murdering Julie Dart. The distinction became one of the defining tensions inside the courtroom. Why confess to one crime while denying another? Prosecutors argued that the partial admission reflected calculation rather than remorse. By conceding overwhelming evidence connected to Stephanie's kidnapping, Sams may have hoped to preserve credibility while distancing himself from the murder charge carrying the greatest moral and legal weight. Partial confessions can sometimes function strategically in criminal trials. Defendants may acknowledge unavoidable facts while attempting to contest the most severe allegations. But the prosecution believed the broader pattern of evidence made separation impossible. The same systems of confinement, planning, and control connected both women directly to Sams. Stephanie Slater's testimony became one of the emotional centers of the proceedings. Survivors entering courtrooms often face extraordinary psychological strain. They must revisit trauma publicly while confronting the person accused of causing it. In Stephanie's case, the ordeal involved recounting days spent in darkness, restraint, uncertainty, and fear. The details she described helped jurors understand not only the physical conditions of captivity, but also the psychological reality of existing inside a controlled environment designed to erase autonomy completely. Her recollections about the workshop's sounds, the rotary telephone, and the nature of the confinement had already proven valuable during the investigation. In court, those same details reinforced the prosecution's argument that Sams had engineered the entire operation carefully and deliberately. The prosecution also relied heavily on forensic and documentary evidence. Handwriting analysis linked Sams to the ransom notes through similarities in writing style end. Spelling patterns. Investigators presented evidence suggesting that the communications used during the extortion scheme reflected his habits and methods. Physical evidence connected him to Julie Dart's murder as well, strengthening the argument that the same offender responsible for Stephanie's kidnapping had also killed the 18-year-old months earlier. While modern audiences sometimes expect dramatic courtroom revelations, many real criminal trials unfold through accumulation rather than sudden surprise. Jurors absorb one layer of evidence after another until patterns become overwhelming. In the Michael Sams case, the prosecution focused on convergence. No single detail stood entirely alone. Instead, workshop evidence, survivor testimony, forensic findings, ransom communications, and behavioral patterns all pointed toward the same conclusion. Another deeply unsettling dimension of the case involved the diary entries discovered after Sam's arrest. These writings exposed aspects of his thinking that many observers found profoundly disturbing. According to the evidence discussed publicly, Sams described moments of physical closeness with Stephanie Slater during captivity, including holding her hand and embracing her. He framed these interactions in emotionally charged terms that suggested he believed some form of attachment existed between captor and captive. In court and in public discussion afterward, those writings reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of a psychologically distorted individual capable of merging coercion with fantasy. The diary entries mattered because they revealed how Sams internally rationalized his behavior. He did not appear to perceive himself solely as a violent offender. Instead, his writings suggested a warped emotional narrative in which domination became intertwined with imagined intimacy. For the public, this contradiction became one of the most horrifying aspects of the case. It forced people to confront the reality that extreme violence can coexist alongside self-delusion, an emotional fantasy inside an offender's mind. Meanwhile, the courtroom atmosphere itself reflected the gravity of the crimes being examined. Cases involving kidnapping and prolonged confinement often generate unique emotional responses because they force jurors to imagine sustained terror rather than isolated moments of violence. Stephanie Slater had lived inside uncertainty for 8 days, unable to know whether she would survive or disappear permanently like Julie Dart. The physical evidence of confinement transformed abstract fear into concrete reality. Jurors were not simply hearing about threats. They were hearing about systems physically constructed to imprison another human being. Michael Sams reportedly maintained much of the composure that had characterized his behavior throughout the investigation. Organized offenders sometimes present themselves in controlled, emotionally restrained ways during trial proceedings, particularly when they view themselves as intellectually superior or strategically disciplined. Prosecutors, however, sought to dismantle any illusion of sophistication by emphasizing the human devastation underlying the crimes. Julie Dart was dead. Stephanie Slater survived, but endured profound psychological trauma. Behind every ransom note and logistical maneuver stood real suffering inflicted deliberately over time. One of the prosecution's most powerful arguments centered on intentionality. The workshop had not appeared accidentally. The confinement boxes had not assembled themselves spontaneously. The alarm systems existed because Sams expected resistance and planned for it. Every preparation demonstrated anticipation of another person's fear. That level of planning significantly shaped how the jury interpreted the crimes. This was not a case about sudden loss of control. It was about sustained exercise of control. As proceedings continued, the cumulative evidence became increasingly difficult for the defense to counter effectively. Stephanie's survival proved enormously significant because living victims can provide testimony, unavailable in murder cases alone. Her ability to describe the environment, the offender's behavior. And the conditions of confinement gave investigators and jurors insight into the mechanics of Sam's operation. At the same time, the evidence surrounding Julie Dart's murder established the lethal reality behind those mechanics. Stephanie survived. Julie did not. Together, their cases revealed the full scope of what Michael Sams had constructed. Eventually, the jury reached its verdict. Michael Sams was convicted on multiple charges, including murder, kidnapping, blackmail, and false imprisonment. The convictions carried multiple life sentences, ensuring he would remain imprisoned for an extremely long time. For investigators, the verdict represented the collapse of a criminal operation that had once appeared terrifyingly sophisticated. For the victims' families, however, legal resolution could never erase what had happened. Julie Dart's life had been taken permanently. Stephanie Slater would continue carrying psychological consequences long after the courtroom emptied. Yet one final detail added another disturbing layer to the case. 3 days after conviction, Michael Sams secretly confessed to killing Julie Dart. The confession reinforced what prosecutors had argued throughout the trial. The crimes were connected by the same offender, the same methods, and the same obsession with domination and control. But the timing of the confession also revealed something psychologically revealing about Sams himself. Even after conviction, he continued attempting to manage information on his own terms. The delayed admission suggested continued desire for control over narrative and acknowledgement. In many ways, the trial exposed the central illusion underlying Michael Sams' self-image. He had imagined himself capable of engineering the perfect crime through planning, technical intelligence, and operational discipline. For a time, he succeeded in creating confusion and fear. But the courtroom demonstrated the limits of that illusion. Human beings leave traces behind. Survivors remember details. Families recognize voices. Patterns emerge. And eventually, the carefully hidden systems built inside isolated workshops become visible to the outside world. By the end of the trial, Michael Sams no longer existed publicly as a quiet heating engineer from Nottinghamshire. He had become known as one of Britain's most notorious kidnappers and murderers, a man whose obsession with control ultimately destroyed multiple lives while exposing the terrifying potential of organized violence concealed behind ordinary appearances. When a major criminal trial ends, public attention often begins to fade almost immediately. Headlines shrink. Television coverage moves elsewhere. Courtrooms empty. But for victims and survivors, the conclusion of legal proceedings rarely feels like an ending. In the Michael Sams case, the convictions closed one chapter of the story while leaving behind years of psychological aftermath, grief, and difficult reflection. The crimes themselves had unfolded over months, but their consequences would stretch across decades. For Stephanie Slater, survival came with a burden invisible to most of the public watching the case from a distance. She escaped the fate that claimed Julie Dart's life. But survival did not erase what happened inside the workshop. Kidnapping cases involving prolonged confinement often leave survivors struggling with forms of trauma that continue long after physical freedom returns. Fear becomes attached to ordinary routines. Silence carries memory. Darkness carries memory. Certain sounds can trigger panic years later. The body may leave captivity while the mind continues revisiting it repeatedly. Stephanie endured 8 days trapped inside an environment specifically designed to eliminate control and orientation. She lived inside darkness, uncertainty, restraint, and isolation while knowing almost nothing about the man imprisoning her or whether release would ever come. That kind of psychological pressure changes people permanently. Yet despite the trauma, Stephanie Slater eventually chose not to disappear from public life entirely. In later years, She became involved in helping other victims of kidnapping and trauma recover psychologically from their experiences. That decision carried enormous emotional significance. Survivors of violent crime often face a difficult balance between protecting their own healing and revisiting painful memories in order to help others. Stephanie's work reflected resilience, but it is important not to romanticize that resilience. Survival stories are sometimes simplified into narratives of triumph, as though courage somehow cancels suffering. The reality is more complicated. Strength and pain often exist together. A survivor may rebuild parts of life while still carrying fear, grief, or psychological scars indefinitely. What Stephanie accomplished after the case mattered precisely because it emerged from genuine suffering rather than the absence of it. Her life after captivity became evidence that victims are more than the worst thing ever done to them. At the same time, the shadow of the case never fully disappeared. Public memory continued associating her name with one of Britain's most infamous kidnappings. That association can become another form of burden for survivors. Society remembers the crime while the individual struggles to reclaim identity beyond it. Stephanie Slater eventually died from cancer in 2017, decades after the events that first brought her into national headlines. Her death prompted renewed reflection on the extraordinary ordeal she survived and the life she attempted to rebuild afterward. In contrast, Julie Dart never had the opportunity to reclaim anything at all. She remained forever 18 years old in the public record of the case. One of the most tragic aspects of murder investigations is the way victims can gradually become frozen in time while the world around them continues moving forward. Julie's life became permanently defined by the circumstances of her death. Yet behind the headlines existed a young woman whose adulthood had barely begun before it was violently taken away. The disparity between Julie and Stephanie also shaped how many people later viewed the Michael Sams case. One woman survived captivity. One did not. Together, their stories exposed the full reality of Sam's violence. For investigators and criminal psychologists, the case remained deeply significant because it illustrated how organized offenders can combine technical planning with emotional distortion. Michael Sams did not operate through uncontrolled frenzy. He engineered systems. He anticipated obstacles. He designed environments intended to maintain dominance over victims physically and psychologically. That calculated structure became one of the defining lessons of the investigation. Even after conviction, authorities continued viewing Sams as dangerous. Over the years, he faced repeated parole reviews, but officials consistently concluded that he remained a risk to the public. Those decisions reflected ongoing concern about both the severity of the crimes and the psychological patterns underlying them. Cases involving prolonged captivity often generate particular caution because they reveal not only willingness to commit violence, but also sustained commitment to maintaining control over victims for extended periods. The workshop at the center of the case remained perhaps the most chilling physical symbol of that mentality. More than any ransom note or telephone call, the workshop represented intention. It demonstrated that Sams had spent time imagining captivity before carrying it out. The coffin-like boxes were not spontaneous constructions. They embodied preparation for future suffering. There's something uniquely disturbing about environments built specifically to imprison human beings. Such spaces reveal that the offender did not merely react violently in a moment of anger. He planned for another person's fear in advance. He anticipated confinement, resistance, and desperation before his victims ever arrived. Over time, many commentators describe Michael Sams as someone obsessed with the perfect crime. That phrase appears often in true crime discussions. But the Sams case reveals how misleading the concept truly is. Perfect crimes rarely exist. Some cases remain unsolved temporarily, but offenders almost always leave traces behind somewhere. In this investigation, those traces emerged through a combination of human memory, forensic analysis, handwriting examination, and emotional recognition. Ironically, despite all of Sam's technical planning, one of the most decisive breakthroughs came from something profoundly human and impossible to engineer completely: familiarity. His own family recognized his voice during the Crime Watch broadcast. The offender who believed he could outmaneuver investigators through planning ultimately exposed himself through recognition by people who knew him intimately. That irony sits at the center of the case's broader meaning. Michael Sams invested enormous energy into systems of secrecy and control. Yet human relationships, memories, and patterns eventually dismantled the illusion of invisibility he tried to construct. The case also demonstrated the importance of survivor testimony in criminal investigations. Stephanie Slater's recollections about sounds, environments, and routines inside the workshop proved invaluable because they transformed vague suspicion into specific investigative direction. Trauma memory is complicated and imperfect, but survivors often preserve fragments capable of unlocking entire cases. Stephanie's ability to recall details from inside darkness became one of the reasons investigators eventually succeeded. Another lasting theme within the Michael Sams case involves the relationship between ordinariness and violence. Public imagination often prefers criminals who appear visibly monstrous or socially isolated because such images create comforting distance. But organized offenders frequently exist inside ordinary routines. Michael Sams worked as a heating engineer. He maintained a conventional outward life. He moved through familiar communities unnoticed. That normal appearance allowed him to construct and operate his hidden world of captivity without immediate suspicion. The discomfort created by cases like this comes partly from recognizing how incomplete our understanding of other people can be. Communities often assume danger announces itself clearly. In reality, some offenders survive precisely because they understand how to appear unremarkable. The case also forced broader reflection on vulnerability and trust. Stephanie Slater encountered Sams through ordinary professional procedure. Julie Dart encountered him under circumstances that investigators believed made her especially vulnerable to exploitation. In both situations, Sams identified opportunities where isolation and control could be established quickly. Modern discussions about workplace safety, loan appointments, and protection for vulnerable individuals often draw lessons from cases like these, where ordinary routines became pathways into extreme danger. Yet despite all the analysis surrounding criminal behavior, investigative procedure, and psychological profiling, the emotional core of the Michael Sams case remains deeply simple. Two women encountered a man obsessed with domination and secrecy. One survived, one did not. Everything else, the ransom strategies, the forensic evidence, the workshop mechanics, the courtroom proceedings, exists around the human reality. And perhaps that is why the image of the wooden confinement box remains so haunting decades later. Not because it reflects criminal genius, but because it represents deliberate cruelty stripped down to its essential purpose. A confined space designed to remove freedom, identity, and hope from another person. In many true crime stories, there is temptation to focus excessively on the offender's intelligence or sophistication. The Michael Sams case resists that framing when examined closely. Yes, he planned carefully. Yes, he understood investigative weaknesses. Yes, he came frighteningly close to evading capture for a time. But the lasting significance of the case lies less in his abilities than in the damage those abilities caused when combined with emotional emptiness and obsession with control. By the end of the investigation, the illusion of the perfect crime had collapsed entirely. The hidden workshop was exposed. The voice was recognized. The patterns became visible. Michael Sam spent years constructing systems intended to erase human autonomy. Yet ultimately the case was solved through deeply human forces, memory, persistence, recognition, and survival. And in the final analysis, that may be the clearest lesson the case leaves behind. However carefully violence is organized, however hidden it becomes, it still leaves human consequences that continue echoing long after courtrooms close and headlines disappear. Years after the trial ended, the Michael Sams case continued to occupy a strange and unsettling place within British criminal history. It was not only remembered because of the brutality of the crimes themselves, but because of the methodical patience behind them. Some crimes horrify because they erupt suddenly in moments of uncontrolled violence. The Sams case frightened people differently. It revealed what could happen when violence was approached with discipline, preparation, and technical precision. Even decades later, investigators and criminologists continued returning to the same disturbing question. How had one seemingly ordinary man managed to build such an elaborate system of captivity without attracting immediate suspicion? Part of the answer lies in the nature of modern life itself. People often imagine danger as something visible and dramatic, something that announces itself clearly before harm occurs. But Michael Sams understood the opposite principle. He understood how invisibility works. He understood routine. He understood how ordinary environments lower human defenses. A heating engineer driving through English towns does not attract attention. An estate agent meeting a potential buyer does not seem unusual. A workshop behind closed doors does not immediately suggest imprisonment and terror. The case forced many people to confront the uncomfortable reality that some of the most dangerous offenders succeed precisely because they appear forgettable. They learn how to exist unnoticed within the rhythms of everyday life. The physical setting of the crimes also remained deeply symbolic long after the investigation concluded. In public memory, the workshop became more than a crime scene. It became a representation of hidden control. Inside that ordinary-looking structure, Michael Sams attempted to create a completely private world governed only by his rules. The coffin-like boxes were central to that vision. They stripped victims of orientation, movement, and identity. Darkness prevented understanding of space. Restraint prevented action. Silence prevented connection to the outside world. Everything about the environment reinforced dependence on the captor. In many ways, the workshop reflected the psychology of coercive control in its purest form. The victim survives only according to the offender's decisions. Time, food, movement, communication, and hope all become controlled externally. That structure explains why the case continued resonating so powerfully with investigators who studied patterns of organized violence. It was not merely kidnapping. It was systematic domination. Yet the very sophistication that initially protected Sams also contributed to his downfall. Organized offenders often become overconfident in their ability to control outcomes. Michael Sams believed preparation could eliminate uncertainty. He planned communication routes. He designed escape prevention systems. He manipulated ransom procedures. He studied investigative behavior. But human beings are unpredictable in ways no system fully controls. Stephanie Slater survived long enough to remember details. Detectives remained persistent despite limited technology. And, perhaps most importantly, human familiarity overcame anonymity when his own family recognized his voice during the Crime Watch broadcast. That moment remains one of the most remarkable turning points in the case. Out of all the technological strategies, surveillance efforts, and investigative procedures involved, One of the decisive breakthroughs came through recognition between people who knew each other personally. The voice Michael Sams believed functioned as a tool of intimidation instead became the thing that exposed him. There is something deeply ironic about that. A man obsessed with secrecy ultimately betrayed by the simple fact that human beings recognize one another. In the years following the convictions, discussions about the case frequently focused on the idea of the perfect crime. Newspapers often used the phrase because Sams had clearly invested enormous effort into planning and concealment. But the longer investigators examined the case, the clearer it became that perfection had never truly existed. What existed instead was temporary advantage. Sams exploited weaknesses in early 1990s investigative systems effectively for a period of time. But even highly organized offenders leave traces behind. Those traces may not appear immediately. They may remain fragmented for months or years. But patterns emerge eventually. Voices sound familiar. Writing habits repeat themselves. Physical evidence accumulates. Survivors remember details buried beneath trauma. The myth of the perfect crime often survives only until investigators gather enough patience and perspective to see the full picture. Another important legacy of the case involved changing awareness around professional safety and vulnerability. Stephanie Slater's kidnapping highlighted the risks faced by workers required to meet strangers, alone in isolated environments. Estate agents across Britain and elsewhere increasingly reevaluated procedures surrounding property. Viewings after the case received widespread attention. Safety protocols that later became more common, identity verification, accompanied viewings, scheduled check-ins, emerged partly from recognition that ordinary professional routines could be exploited by organized offenders. Cases like this often influence society quietly through procedural change rather than dramatic public transformation. The impact spreads into policies, workplace expectations, and institutional caution developed to prevent similar crimes from happening again. At the same time, the Michael Sams investigation also demonstrated the importance of survivor-centered policing. Stephanie Slater's testimony was treated not as secondary emotional evidence, but as essential investigative material. Detectives understood that her sensory memories carried value even when fragmented or incomplete. That approach reflected growing recognition within criminal investigations that trauma survivors often preserve crucial information in ways different from ordinary witnesses. The human mind under extreme stress may lose chronology while retaining sound, texture, rhythm, or spatial impressions with extraordinary clarity. Stephanie's ability to remember workshop, noises, and environmental details became instrumental in narrowing investigative focus. Her survival changed the case entirely. Without her testimony, Michael Sams might have remained linked only indirectly to Julie Dart's murder for far longer. The contrast between Julie and Stephanie continued haunting public understanding of the case long. After sentencing, two women entered Michael Sams' hidden world of confinement. One emerged alive, one did not. That contrast created painful reflection about chance, timing, and survival itself. Stephanie Slater later used her experience to support other victims. Julie Dart never had the opportunity to speak for herself again after July 1991. True crime history often risks reducing victims into narrative functions within larger investigations. But the emotional truth remains simple and devastating. Julie Dart lost the rest of her life at 18 years old. Stephanie Slater spent decades carrying memories of captivity most people cannot fully imagine. Meanwhile, Michael Sams aged behind prison walls while repeatedly being denied release because authorities continued viewing him as dangerous. That continuing assessment reflected more than punishment alone. It reflected concern about the underlying psychology revealed through the crimes. The workshop, the diary writings, the planning, and the emotional distortions uncovered after arrest all suggested a man whose need for control operated at profound psychological depth. The diaries in particular remained disturbing to investigators because they exposed the disconnect between Sam's self-perception and the suffering he inflicted. He described feelings of emotional attachment towards Stephanie while simultaneously imprisoning and terrorizing her. This contradiction was not evidence of compassion. It was evidence of distorted thinking in which domination became confused with intimacy. Such psychological contradictions appear frequently in coercive offenders. They do not see victims as fully independent individuals. Instead, victims become absorbed into the offender's emotional narrative, stripped of autonomy and recast as participants in fantasies of connection or dependence. Understanding that distortion became important not only for explaining Sam's specifically, but for understanding broader patterns of coercive violence. As the years passed, the Michael Sams case increasingly became studied not simply as a sensational crime story, but as an example of how organized offenders construct systems of control. Criminologists, investigators, and psychologists examined the methods he used because they revealed the intersection of planning, technical ability, and emotional pathology. Yet despite all the analysis, one fact remained constant. Behind every procedural lesson stood irreversible human damage. It is easy in retrospect to focus on the mechanics of the investigation, the phone calls, the handwriting analysis, the workshop evidence, the Crime Watch breakthrough. But at the center of the story were real people trapped inside fear and uncertainty. Stephanie Slater lying in darkness, wondering whether she would survive another night. Julie Dart attempting to escape confinement before the alarm system exposed her effort. Families waiting for answers while police searched desperately for leads. Detectives slowly realizing they were confronting an offender far more organized than initially expected. Those human experiences matter more than the mythology that later surrounded the case. And perhaps that is the final truth the Michael Sams story leaves behind. The case was never really about criminal genius. It was about what happens when intelligence becomes separated from empathy and redirected toward domination. Michael Sams built systems designed to control other human beings completely. For a time, those systems worked. They concealed him. They protected him. They terrified his victims. But ultimately, even the most carefully engineered structures cannot erase human connection entirely. A survivor remembered details. Investigators kept searching. A family recognized a familiar voice. And slowly, the hidden world inside the workshop was pulled into the light. In the end, the story of Michael Sams is not the story of a perfect crime. It is the story of how cruelty can hide behind ordinary appearances, how survival can become evidence, and how even carefully constructed darkness eventually fractures under persistence, memory, and truth.